Many individuals believe that when depositing a substantial sum of cash at the bank, the smartest approach is maintaining the amount slightly below $10,000. It appears cautious. It appears sensible. And for decades, this concept has circulated like conventional wisdom among acquaintances, community members, even relatives. However, what many individuals, particularly older adults, fail to understand is that this precise practice can trigger the very issue they were attempting to prevent initially. Actually, the instant someone begins dividing deposits into lesser amounts specifically to remain beneath that threshold, they may unintentionally enter into something federal regulations consider extremely serious. And the unfortunate aspect is that individuals who become entangled in this circumstance almost never possessed any harmful intentions whatsoever. They're not concealing funds. They're not engaging in anything unlawful with the currency. They might have liquidated a vehicle they've possessed for 15 years, obtained assistance from their offspring, or simply transferred their own resources from one institution to another. Completely normal circumstances. However, when those activities occur in a particular sequence, the financial system doesn't recognize the personal history behind them. It exclusively recognizes amounts and sequences, and occasionally those amounts generate a signal that prompts inquiries. I want to guide you through precisely how this operates, because once you comprehend the regulation behind it, the complete circumstance becomes much clearer and much simpler to prevent. And somewhat later, I'm going to share about a retired educator who encountered this challenge while simply attempting to arrange her accounts after losing her spouse. Her experience demonstrates just how readily this can occur to someone who has conducted everything correctly their whole existence. Hello, I'm Sofia, and I dedicate considerable time investigating the types of monetary regulations and financial practices that tend to catch older adults unexpectedly. Not because the regulations are hidden, but because the manner they actually function is often vastly different from what individuals learn through informal communication. Throughout the years, I've observed that certain pieces of monetary guidance circulate quickly among acquaintances and relatives, particularly in senior communities. Someone learns something from a community member. That community member learned it from someone at the institution years prior, and before long it transforms into a regulation everyone accepts as accurate. The $10,000 financial institution deposit regulation is one of the most misinterpreted examples of that. Individuals learn about it, and then they attempt to navigate around it without ever understanding that the navigation is the one thing that can actually generate difficulty. Therefore, in this presentation, I'm going to explain what the regulation genuinely is, what institutions are actually obligated to document, and why the documentation itself is not the challenge most individuals believe it is. Then, we'll examine the three circumstances where older adults encounter this matter most frequently: liquidating something for currency, obtaining funds from relatives, and transferring resources between their own accounts. And throughout, I'll demonstrate the simple documentation that safeguards you if inquiries ever arise later. Because once you comprehend what the framework is actually seeking, the resolution becomes surprisingly straightforward. And it's probably the contrary of what many individuals have been informed for years. To comprehend why this regulation generates so much uncertainty, you first must comprehend what the $10,000 limit actually represents. Behind the operations, institutions in the United States are obligated by federal regulation to submit something termed a currency transaction documentation whenever a client deposits exceeding $10,000 in physical money. The critical word there is physical money. Not a payment instrument, not an electronic transfer, not funds moving digitally between accounts, physical currency, bills. If exceeding $10,000 in physical money enters an account in a single activity, the institution automatically submits that documentation. The significant thing to comprehend is that this occurs silently and systematically. The institution doesn't contact you beforehand. They don't request authorization, and most of the occasions, the client never even realizes it occurred. The documentation simply becomes component of a massive database that monetary authorities utilize to monitor substantial currency movements across the financial framework. Every year, millions of these documentations are submitted, and the overwhelming proportion of them never result to anything else. No telephone contact, no examination, no subsequent inquiries. They're simply records. This regulation was established decades prior to assist detect large-scale monetary violations like currency cleaning, substance trafficking, and organized illegal activity where enormous amounts of currency move through the framework. Those operations frequently depend on physical currency because digital transfers leave a transparent trail. Therefore, regulators constructed a framework where substantial currency activities are automatically recorded. However, here's the essential piece that most individuals never learn. The documentation itself is not an allegation. It doesn't indicate the authorities believe you conducted something incorrect. It doesn't initiate an examination by itself. It simply documents that a certain amount of currency moved through the financial framework at a certain moment. Consider it more like a receipt in a giant storage system than a warning indication. Where the uncertainty begins is what occurs after individuals learn about this regulation. Somewhere throughout, someone decided that if the institution exclusively documents deposits exceeding $10,000, the intelligent thing to accomplish would be to remain beneath that threshold. And once that concept started circulating, it developed a momentum of its own. Individuals began providing each other guidance that appeared reasonable on the surface. If you possess $11,000 in physical money, deposit $9,000 today and the remainder following week. If you're bringing a substantial amount to the institution, divide it between accounts. Have your partner deposit portion of it at another location. Separate it into lesser pieces so it doesn't activate the documentation. It appears like common sense problem resolution. The challenge is that the regulation anticipated that precise behavior because once someone intentionally separates funds into lesser deposits to prevent the $10,000 documentation limit, the activity enters a completely different classification under federal regulation. That behavior has a designation, structuring, and structuring is not simply discouraged or disapproved. It's actually regarded a federal violation. The contradiction is almost distressing when you observe how frequently this occurs to normal individuals. Someone invests 40 years working honestly, preserving funds carefully, conducting everything by the regulations. Then they learn a piece of well-intentioned guidance about remaining beneath the threshold, and suddenly the manner they deposit their own funds generates a sequence that appears questionable to the financial framework. The explanation structuring is handled so seriously is because it's precisely how illegal organizations use to move substantial amounts of currency through institutions without activating the documentation framework. Instead of depositing $50,000 at once, they would separate it into lesser pieces and dispatch individuals to different locations or different occasions. Regulators learn to observe for those sequences, and today, contemporary financial software is extremely effective at identifying them. It doesn't consider whether the individual making the deposits is a professional violator or a retired school educator. It simply recognizes repeated deposits that consistently arrive just beneath the documentation limit. And the framework identifies the sequence for examination. And this is where the circumstance becomes particularly frustrating for older adults because the individuals who become caught in these sequences often believe they were conducting the sensible thing. They believe they were preventing complication. They believe they were safeguarding themselves from unwanted scrutiny. In actuality, the very action they completed to remain unnoticed can be the thing that attracts scrutiny initially. That's why comprehending this regulation matters so significantly. Not because depositing a substantial amount of funds is dangerous. It isn't, but because misinterpreting how the regulation operates can guide individuals to make decisions that generate unnecessary inquiries later. Now, let's discuss where this actually appears in actual existence, because there are 3 circumstances where older adults encounter this matter repeatedly. The first one occurs when someone liquidates something for currency, and it's probably more frequent than you might believe. One of the most frequent manners older adults encounter this circumstance is surprisingly straightforward. It begins with liquidating something they've possessed for years. Perhaps it's the pickup vehicle that's been positioned in the driveway since you discontinued needing it for employment. Perhaps it's a watercraft you no longer utilize, a recreational vehicle that hasn't departed the storage in a decade, or even a vintage automobile you've been maintaining since your offspring were young. Individual sales like these frequently occur in currency, particularly when the purchaser desires a quick, straightforward arrangement without institution financing involved. Therefore, imagine someone appears, examines the vehicle, concurs on a value, and provides you $11,000 in currency. It's a completely valid activity. Two adults concur on a value. The ownership changes possession, and everyone departs satisfied. The subsequent step appears obvious. You proceed to the institution and deposit the funds. And when you deposit $11,000 in currency, the institution submits a currency transaction documentation because the amount is exceeding $10,000. That's it. No complication, no allegation, no warning indication attached to your identity. The institution employee might not even reference it because the procedure is systematic and automatic. Millions of these documentations are submitted every year, and the vast proportions simply exist in a database without anyone ever examining them again. However, here's where the challenge sometimes begins. Later that occasion, you reference the liquidation to an acquaintance or community member. Perhaps you're conversing over beverages or discussing after religious services, and the subject appears, and someone states something that appears beneficial. You realize you probably shouldn't have deposited all that simultaneously. If you maintain it beneath $10,000, the institution doesn't have to document it. That observation gets repeated in different manners all the occasions. Sometimes individuals state $9,900. Sometimes they state $9,500 just to be cautious. The amounts vary, but the concept is always the same. Remain beneath the limit. Therefore, the subsequent occasion currency arrives. Perhaps you liquidate another piece of apparatus. Perhaps you obtain a payment for something you've been maintaining. You attempt to follow that guidance. Instead of depositing the complete amount, you divide it up. $8,000 today, $3,000 following week. It appears cautious. It appears arranged. However, from the perspective of the financial framework, that sequence appears precisely like someone deliberately attempting to prevent the documentation regulation. And that's the instant when a perfectly clean activity can begin to appear unusual, not because of the funds itself, but because of the sequence generated by those lesser deposits. When the framework recognizes repeated activities that appear designed to remain beneath the documentation threshold, that sequence is what activates scrutiny. The safer and simpler approach is actually the contrary of what many individuals assume. If you obtain $11,000 from liquidating a vehicle, deposit the complete $11,000 at once. Allow the documentation be submitted automatically. There's nothing incorrect with that activity. What safeguards you is the documentation behind it, a liquidation record demonstrating the purchaser's identity and the liquidation value, the ownership transfer confirming the possession change, and the institution receipt demonstrating when the funds was deposited. Those three pieces of records tell the complete narrative clearly and immediately. If anyone ever inquired about the deposit, which is uncommon, you would simply possess a clean documentation trail explaining precisely where the funds originated from. The subsequent circumstance where older adults encounter uncertainty around this regulation occurs inside relatives, and it usually begins with positive intentions. As offspring grow older and become monetarily stable, it's not uncommon for them to desire to assist their guardians. Sometimes it's because healthcare expenses appear unexpectedly. Sometimes a covering needs replacing or a major residence repair appears. Other occasions, an offspring liquidates a commercial enterprise or obtains a substantial reward and decides they desire to distribute some of that achievement with their guardians. Therefore, a male offspring might state, "Allow me to provide you $15,000 to assist with the residence." Or a female offspring might transmit funds to assist cover healthcare bills that protection didn't fully handle. These circumstances are incredibly frequent, and they are completely lawful. Actually, the revenue regulations around contributions are often misinterpreted in the contrary direction. The individual obtaining the contribution typically does not owe revenue assessment on that funds whatsoever. A contribution is not regarded revenue for the recipient. However, once again, the uncertainty begins when everyone involved begins attempting to make the transfer simpler. The male offspring might state, "I'll transmit it in lesser amounts so the institution doesn't make a significant matter out of it." The female offspring might suggest depositing some of the funds this period and the remainder later. A partner might state, "We'll just position half in my account and half in yours." All of these suggestions originate from the same inclination to maintain things straightforward and prevent documentation. Unfortunately, those well-intentioned strategies can unintentionally generate the same structuring sequence we discussed earlier. Instead, the cleanest manner to handle a relative contribution is straightforward. Transfer the complete amount in one activity. If the funds is transmitted by payment instrument or electronic transfer, the documentation trail already exists automatically. The institution can observe precisely where the resources originated from, and the transfer is recorded. If the contribution occurs in currency, the optimal approach is still to deposit the complete amount at once and simply maintain a brief written documentation explaining it. That documentation doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't require a legal professional, and it doesn't need authentication. A straightforward letter operates perfectly well. Something as basic as a signed and dated note that states, "I provided this amount of funds to my guardian as a personal contribution on this occasion." That single page of documentation combined with the institution deposit receipt provides transparent records of the activity. If inquiries ever arise years later, the explanation is already positioned in your documentation. Now, there's one more circumstance where older adults encounter this regulation, and it's the one that surprises individuals the most because in this instance, the funds isn't originating from a liquidation, and it isn't originating from relatives. It's your own funds moving between your own accounts. And this is precisely where the narrative of that retired educator begins. The narrative that genuinely brought this matter into perspective for me involved a retired educator who had invested more than 4 decades in the classroom. She was 69 years old, recently widowed, and attempting to organize through the monetary pieces of her existence after her spouse passed away. Like many couples who have been together for a substantial duration, they had accumulated accounts in different locations throughout the years, one institution from when they first purchased their residence. Another account opened later for convenience, a savings certificate that had been continued a few occasions. None of it was complicated in a monetary sense, but emotionally it was exhausting. When someone you've distributed your existence with is suddenly departed, even systematic decisions appear heavier. Her objective was straightforward. She desired to bring everything together into one institution so she could manage her accounts more readily going forward. Instead of managing statements from multiple organizations, she believed it would be simpler to maintain everything in one location. That decision makes perfect sense, and it's something monetary consultants often recommend. Consolidating accounts simplifies documentation maintaining, reduces uncertainty, and makes long-term planning simpler. However, the manner she moved the funds is what triggered the challenge. Instead of transferring the resources all at once, she moved them gradually throughout a few weeks. $9,000 one week, $8,000 another occasion, then another transfer just beneath the $10,000 threshold a few occasions later. She wasn't attempting to conceal anything. Actually, she wasn't even considering the documentation regulation. She simply assumed lesser transfers would be simpler to manage and less complicated to handle, while she was already overwhelmed with documentation, funeral arrangements, and everything else that follows the departure of a partner. About 6 weeks later, she obtained a correspondence requesting her to explain the sequence of activities. Imagine how unsettling that must appear. You've conducted nothing incorrect. The funds is your own resources accumulated throughout decades of honest employment. Yet, suddenly, there's an inquiry about how it moved through your accounts. Circumstances like this rarely escalate into anything serious once the explanation is provided, but the experience itself can still be stressful, particularly for someone already experiencing a difficult period. And the explanation it occurred had nothing to accomplish with who she was as an individual. The framework didn't recognize she had departed her spouse. It didn't recognize she had been an educator for 40 years. It didn't recognize she was simply attempting to make her monetary existence a little simpler. All the framework observed was a progression of deposits repeatedly arriving just beneath the $10,000 limit within a brief duration of occasions. To automated monitoring software, that sequence can resemble structuring. This is one of the most significant things to comprehend about contemporary financial oversight. Much of it is driven by software designed to identify sequences, not personal situations. The calculation seeks certain behaviors that historically matched monetary violation. Repeated deposits just beneath the documentation limit are one of those behaviors. Once that sequence appears, the framework identifies it for examination. Now, here's the component that matters for anyone managing their retirement resources. Moving your own funds between your own accounts is perfectly lawful and extremely frequent. Individuals accomplish it every occasion when they change institutions, consolidate accounts, or shift resources from a maturing savings certificate into a new account. The transfer itself isn't the matter. The sequence of lesser transfers is what can generate uncertainty. Therefore, when you need to move a substantial amount of funds between accounts, the safest and simplest approach is to move it in a single activity whenever achievable. An electronic transfer accomplishes this cleanly and immediately. An official institution payment instrument can accomplish the same thing if you're moving resources from one organization to another. Either manner, the activity generates a transparent documentation that demonstrates precisely where the funds started and where it concluded up. Sometimes an institution employee might inquire a quick inquiry about the transfer. That's normal. They're simply confirming the origin of the resources. The response can be straightforward and brief. These are my personal resources being transferred from another account I possess. One statement is usually all that's needed. The objective isn't to provide a lengthy explanation. It's simply to confirm that the funds is originating from a valid origin. The records you maintain in circumstances like this is also very straightforward. A statement from the original account demonstrating the balance before the transfer, the confirmation of the electronic transfer, or the receipt from the official institution payment instrument. If the funds originated from a savings certificate that matured, maintain the notice demonstrating the maturity payout. These records together form a transparent timeline that explains the complete movement of the resources. And this brings us to something that many individuals overlook when considering monetary regulations like this. What genuinely safeguards you isn't attempting to prevent documentations or limits. It's possessing transparent records that explains what actually occurred. In other words, the documentation trail is what matters most. Once you comprehend that concept, the complete circumstance becomes much less intimidating because instead of worrying about whether a deposit might activate a documentation, you concentrate on something much more practical, making certain the activity can be explained clearly if anyone ever inquires about it. And there are 5 straightforward records that make that explanation incredibly simple. Once you comprehend how the documentation framework actually operates, the concentration shifts away from worrying about the $10,000 threshold and towards something much more practical: records. In almost every circumstance where an institution or monetary organization inquires about an activity, they're not attempting to trap you or accuse you of anything. They simply need to comprehend where the funds originated from and why it moved the manner it did. And the fastest, simplest manner to respond that inquiry is with a small collection of records that explain the narrative clearly. The first and most significant documentation is something that demonstrates the explanation the funds exists initially. In other words, what generated the activity. If you liquidated a vehicle, that documentation is the liquidation record. If a relative provided you funds, it's a brief contribution correspondence stating the amount and the occasion. If you moved resources between your own accounts, the explanation might simply be the transfer documentation from the institution. The purpose of this documentation is straightforward. It connects the funds to a genuine occurrence. Without it, you're just someone who deposited a substantial amount of currency and is attempting to explain it verbally. With it, the explanation is already written down. The subsequent piece of records is an institution statement from the account where the funds originally originated from. This becomes particularly significant when resources are moving between accounts you possess. The first inquiry anyone examining an activity might inquire is very straightforward. Where was the funds before it appeared here? A statement demonstrating the balance in the original account responds that inquiry instantly. It establishes that the resources already existed and were simply transferred from one location to another. The third item is confirmation of the activity itself. That might be an electronic transfer receipt, an official institution payment instrument stub, or the deposit confirmation from the institution. These records demonstrate the precise occasion and amount of the movement. They're essentially timestamps that verify when the activity occurred. And the positive information is they require almost no effort to maintain. Most institutions provide digital confirmations automatically, so preserving a copy frequently requires less than 30 seconds. The fourth piece of the puzzle is making certain your revenue documentation tell the same narrative as your institution documentation. For example, If you liquidated a piece of property or apparatus and deposited the funds, that liquidation might also appear somewhere on your revenue documentation. When both documentation align, the explanation becomes even stronger because it demonstrates that the monetary activity was properly documented where it needed to be. When the amounts match across records, there's nothing remaining to inquiry. And the fifth piece of protection is how you respond if an inquiry ever does appear. Sometimes an institution might contact and inquire for clarification about an activity sequence. When that occurs, the optimal approach is usually the simplest one. Provide a transparent response once, supported by the records you already possess. There's no need to over-explain or volunteer extra details that weren't requested. A brief explanation backed by documentation resolves most circumstances immediately. If the matter ever becomes more complicated, which is uncommon, that's the point where it makes sense to communicate with a certified accountant or revenue legal professional before providing additional information. When you step back and examine these 5 pieces together, you begin to recognize the bigger perspective. None of them are complicated. None require special legal training. There's simply documentation that explain the existence occurrences behind monetary activities. Liquidating something, obtaining assistance from relatives, or moving your own resources between accounts are all normal components of managing funds. Records just ensures those occurrences can be comprehended clearly if anyone ever needs to examine them later. Now, before we conclude this up, there are a few concepts about the $10,000 regulation that circulate constantly, and they trigger more uncertainty than almost anything else. You've probably learned at least one of them before. The first misconception is the one we touched on earlier, that depositing $9,900 somehow maintains you protected. In actuality, that specific threshold is one of the most commonly identified deposit amounts there is. When someone repeatedly deposits amounts that arrive just beneath the documentation limit, the sequence stands out very clearly to monitoring frameworks. Institutions aren't exclusively seeking deposits exceeding $10,000. They're also observing for sequences that suggest someone is intentionally remaining beneath that threshold. Therefore, the concept that $9,900 is a protected zone simply isn't accurate. The subsequent misconception is the belief that exclusively individuals involved in unlawful activity ever obtain inquiries about their activities. That assumption appears comforting, but it isn't accurate. The monitoring frameworks utilized by institutions are largely automated. They aren't evaluating someone's character or examining their existence narrative before identifying a sequence. They're simply recognizing activity that matches certain criteria. That indicates perfectly honest individuals sometimes obtain systematic inquiries about activities that appear unusual from a data perspective. Once those inquiries are responded, the circumstance usually concludes there. The third misconception is one that older adults learn surprisingly frequently. The concept that once you're existing on a fixed revenue, these regulations no longer genuinely apply to you. Some individuals assume that because they're no longer operating a commercial enterprise or earning a substantial salary, their activities won't attract scrutiny. However, the documentation requirements don't include an age exclusion or a retirement exclusion. A 72-year-old depositing currency is handled precisely the same manner as a 35-year-old commercial enterprise proprietor depositing currency. The framework simply documents the activity, and comprehending that actuality is actually empowering because once you recognize how the regulation operates and what genuinely matters, you can manage your financial activities without worrying about accidental errors. When you remove all the uncertainty, all the misconceptions, and all the partially accurate guidance that circulates about the $10,000 regulation, the actuality is actually very straightforward. I examine every observation, and they're incredibly beneficial because they demonstrate which subjects individuals are encountering most frequently. Whatever circumstance appears the most in the observations is what I'll concentrate on in the subsequent presentation. Therefore, if there's something about your own monetary circumstance that appears a little uncertain or complicated, there's a positive possibility someone else is wondering about the same thing. Appreciation for investing this duration with me, and I'll observe you in the subsequent.